I'm pleased to introduce you all to Julie Acker. Julie has been a Master Gardener since 2019. She has a bachelor's and a master's degree in English literature, and she has retired from publishing, but since then has pursued graduate courses in horticulture at the University of Maryland. In her spare time, she's interested in running, reading, gardening, and also playing fetch with her dog and cat, although not necessarily in that order. And she's quite an expert on native plants and replacing invasives with native plants. So we're really excited to hear from her about today's topic, and she'll tell you more about it shortly. So with that, Julie, I will hand this over to you to get us started with today's presentation. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I appreciate the introduction. So hello, everybody. I am, first of all, so delighted that you all care enough about this topic to come learn more about it. I'm going to throw a lot of information and plant names at you, but rest assured, you will be able to find a link to this presentation, as Caitlin said, as well as links to lots of other exhaustive resources about native and invasive plants right on our website, mgnv.org. Let's get started. So most of you had to give a speech at some point or another in school, and you learned that you're supposed to grab the audience's attention immediately with something. And here it is. Nearly half of all insects worldwide have already disappeared. There's been a 75% decline in just the past 26 years. So think about your windshield during the summer after a road trip as a kid versus nowadays. There are far fewer bugs splattered on your windshield. In just the last 50 years, about 70% of the world's birds, amphibians, mammals, fish, and reptiles have also vanished. So let's talk a little bit more about insects for a minute. According to Doug Tallamy, whom I will reference a lot, he's a prominent entomologist, ecologist, and conservationist at the University of Delaware, whom probably many of you have heard of. He's written several best-selling books on how people can help restore native landscapes in their backyards. According to Dr. Tallamy, plants are the first trophic level, and that means the energy that sustains all life. So without the energy that plants make, humans could not exist. So the question is, how does this energy make its way to other animals and all the way up to humans? And the second trophic level are animals that eat plants. So this obviously includes deer, rabbits, groundhogs. We think of small mammals that eat plants. But it turns out that the animals like those are pretty unimportant in the transfer of energy to higher trophic levels. What is really good at transferring this energy? Any guesses? Insects. So Doug Tallamy says, and I quote, "I cannot overemphasize how important insects herbivores are to the health of all terrestrial ecosystems. 37% of animal species are insects that eat plants, and they are very good at converting that plant tissue to insect tissue, and therefore providing food to all the animals that eat the insects. In fact, a large percentage of the world's fauna depend entirely on insects to access the energy stored in plants. And birds are a particularly good example. So 96% of all terrestrial bird species in North America rely on insects and the spiders that eat those insects to feed their young. And pound for pound, most insect species contain more protein than beef, and their bodies are extremely high in valuable energy. So, you know, the joke that when you swallow a bug by accident and people joke, protein. Well, it's actually very true. So you might think, ugh, yuck, I hate bugs. But of 4 million or so insect species on Earth, and there are only 9,500 species of birds, so that gives you an idea how many insects there are, only 1% interact with humans in negative ways. I'm sure we can all think of at least one kind of insect that we interact with in negative ways. The other 99% of insects, what do? They pollinate plants, they return nutrients tied up in dead plants and animals to the soil. They keep populations of insect herbivores in check. They aerate and enrich the soil. Think about those cicadas making the holes. And they provide food either directly or indirectly for most other animals. Now, I have an entire other presentation that sings the praises of the ecological benefits of insects for humans, but for now, we're going to focus on something that some of you might care more about. If we have fewer insects, and we do, this is a big problem for everything that eats insects. So, according to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the population of North American birds has dropped nearly 30% since 1970. That's almost 3 billion birds just gone. And again, one of the biggest factors is loss of native habitat. And native plants, by and large, are the only plants that native insects can eat. So you see the problem here. If insects are the most important link in the food chain and the transfer of energy upwards, including humans, and we are rapidly losing the only plants our insects can eat, Houston, we have a problem. So much native habitat has been destroyed that ecologists agree that only 3 to 5% of the land in our country remains undisturbed habitat for plants and animals. And this is all from Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home book. Doug summarizes that, quote, we have taken and modified for our own use between 95 and 97% of all the land in the lower 48 states. 41.5% of our land is in agriculture, which means that we've converted just above half of the land to cities and suburbia. And as far as our wildlife is concerned, we've shrunk the continental US to about 1/20th of its original size. And because our refuges and woodlots are not contiguous habitats, but survive as scattered islands from coast to coast, the effective size of undisturbed land in the US is far smaller than those statistics indicate. So, when extinction adjusts the number of species that remain for the plants, mammals, reptiles, birds, and invertebrates of North America, something that will happen within most of our lifetimes, we will have lost 95% of the species that greeted the pilgrims, unquote. That's right out of Doug Tallamy's book. So, again, one major cause is non native plants that don't support our native or local animals, and that includes insects, birds, and mammals. So, a lot of people move to a suburban neighborhood where native plants have been wiped out for development, and many, if not most, have replaced the native landscape that was there before development with non native plants. And indeed, animal species have declined significantly in just the last 50 years because of these factors: destruction of habitat. In the US alone, 150 million acres of native plants has been lost to urban sprawl. Invasive plants and animals, climate change, and exploitation that would include hunting, poaching, and pollution. So these are the statistics for 2024. The 2026 report isn't out yet. It comes out every 2 years. But in 2022, when I wrote this presentation, the world wildlife statistics was 69% decline. So I'm a little afraid what the 2026 statistic will say. We're at 73% in 2024. We'll keep our eyes out on that. But humans are also affected. We have far fewer native plants that provide humans with the medicine, resources, and food. There's an increase in disease. The non-native invasive Japanese barberry thickets in the woods, they provide the perfect microclimate for black-legged ticks. So more barberries equals more ticks. Also, a fire risk is increased because non-natives burn more easily, and most invasives are fire and heat resistant. They're more fire and heat resistant than natives. They burn more slowly in a forest fire. So that damages the native plants that can't withstand the heat for long periods. Also, these invasive vines, like English ivy, carry fire up to the tree canopy so that it can spread more readily. And then there's just dollars. US spends billions to eradicate invasives and to manage and protect valuable agricultural crops and livestock. And I think we've probably all noticed that deer forage more in our gardens because invasives like English ivy, Pachysandra vinca, barberry, lesser celandine, and Japanese stiltgrass are blanketing the forest floors and killing their native plant food. Non native plants cannot function as food for our native insects. Over millions of years, our native insects have co evolved with our native plants so that our insects can only eat certain native plants. They can't change millions of years of evolution, sadly, and just simply eat the non native plants. Therefore, a landscape without native plants is a food desert. Non-native invasive plants go a step further and they crowd out, kill, and prevent the germination of native plants that the animals need to survive. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what does invasive mean. And I just want to ask everybody who's tuned in here, what do you think invasive means? And Caitlin, if you could read out some of the answers, that would be great.
Joy says, a plant that prevents natives from surviving. Lindsay says, it's not from here and it's harmful. Eve says, non-local plants imported from other locations. And Eva says, non-native spreading, negatively affecting commercial or individual use versus aggressive, which natives can be.
Well, I think I can just hang up my hat and go away because you guys have nailed it. So, a lot of people aren't familiar with the concept of invasive plants and animals. And a lot of people think of invasive as something that just takes over the garden aggressively, like mint or trumpet vine. I had a lady a couple of weeks ago tell me that she had invasive sycamore trees in her yard. And in fact, trumpet vine is a fabulous native vine that attracts hummingbirds, but some of us might have discovered it's definitely hard to get rid of once you've given it a home. The term invasive, as you guys have pointed out in the chat, is different than aggressive. An aggressive plant is one that you've planted, it takes over your garden, it's hard to control, it's challenging to get rid of it. I once planted a low growing yarrow in my garden, Achillea millefolium, and the variety was Ortel's rose. And I had to just yank it out because it quickly took over the entire garden. But you guys are very in tune. So, the actual definition of invasive, as you've mentioned, is it has to be not native to our ecosystem and it has to cause harm. So, those are the two basic criteria. As you can see in that photo, that English ivy has climbed up those trees and killed those trees along the trail. Okay, so now that we understand the definition of invasive, just kind of a show of hands, or I want people to chime in. Is this photo exemplifying an invasive plant? Who thinks this is invasive and who thinks, no, this is okay?
We've got several yeses and one person noting that it's calorie pear.
I don't really need to be giving this presentation to this group. All right. So, of course, the difference about how this plant is taking over is that this is kind of a wild, natural area. It has escaped purposeful plantings by cultivation by humans, and it is out competing native trees and shrubs and is creating a monoculture of the calorie pear tree, which is definitely causing harm to the local environment. And of course, why is it causing harm? Because native plants cannot germinate there. They are no longer available to the birds, insects, mammals that rely on the seeds, the fruits, the leaves of the native trees and shrubs. So, diversity of species, even in your yard, maybe especially in your yard, is crucial. So, we've got it. The key takeaways are non-native to the ecosystem and it's causing harm. Okay, so not planting invasives and removing invasives you have is really important because invasives are causing harm to both humans and animals in the ecosystem. So, just to get more into the dirt of this, pun intended, ecosystem efficiency is a measure of how much energy is retained in an ecosystem, how much energy is transferred up the food chain. So, more energy in the system is beneficial for humans, obviously. A system with more energy produces more plant and animal biomass. So, as Doug Tallamy says, I'm quoting again, from a selfish human perspective, more energy in the system means more fish, more lumber, more oxygen, more water filters, more carbon dioxide absorption, and more large weather system buffering. And studies have proven that non-native plants have far less insect biomass. There are fewer insects on them and fewer insects eating them and passing that energy up. And therefore, they don't contribute energy to the higher trophic levels that are so important for human survival. Also, foreign pests and diseases have come here on invasive plants. So, by and large, things that have damaged or nearly eradicated native plants were imported here on native plants. And some good examples would be chestnut blight, Japanese beetles, anthracnose, which is very common on Coosa dogwoods, which are resistant to it. and hemlock woolly adelgid. So not only are natives more beneficial to humans, but invasive species obviously cause a world of headaches. Sadly, once the non-native plant reaches an invasive stage, they're nearly impossible to eradicate. You probably all know the answers to this too, but how do you think invasive plants got here? Let's just get some quick answers to that. And I suspect this educated audience knows this answer, or these answers, I should say.
The horticulture trade, purposely imported for specific uses, some on purpose, like kudzu, some by accident, like shipments, and humans.
All right, this is a very knowledgeable audience. Exactly. So people purchase them for one, they're purchased as ornamentals and they're planted. They're still for sale in nurseries, even though these are extremely invasive plants. English ivy, that was brought to the US by settlers back in colonial days. It has been and continues to be widely sold as an ornamental plant. Barberry, that was shipped from Russia in 1875 to the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. And it became very popular from the early 1900s through the 1970s because of this ability to form these dense thickets, which provided them with privacy. It's very popular now because the deer don't touch it. That is actually in the middle of a photo of Barberry taking over a forest in my former neighborhood. Now, Bradford pear actually has a very interesting story. It was created in the early 1900s by a team of scientists who were trying to develop a hybrid pear tree that was resistant to a disease called fire blight in Oregon and California. This disease was threatening the native pear tree populations in local orchards. And they discovered a tree in China called the Callery pear. It's near what is now Wuhan, near the Yangtze River. And its main characteristic was that it was growing everywhere in any condition. So scientists brought masses of its seeds back to the US, and they wound up as trees in a test orchard not far from here at the US Plant Introduction Station in Prince George's County. And then in the 1950s, a horticulturist named John Creech saw one of the specimens there, decided it was the bee's knees. It would make the ideal street tree because of its beauty and toughness. And he named it Bradford. And he released it to the nursery trade in January of 1960. And after that, it took off like wildfire. And it was supposed to be sterile, but oops, it's definitely not sterile, not at all. There's a lot more to the story, and it's very interesting. I would encourage anyone who's interested to Google a Washington Post magazine article about it, published September 17th in 2018. So, as the listeners and viewers have pointed out, invasives were also introduced on purpose, a lot of time to control erosion before anyone knew they were invasive, of course. Kudzu is a very good example. It was introduced to the United States from Japan at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876 as an ornamental and forage crop plant, and it was supposed to help reduce erosion. Some invasives, yes, were an oops. They were introduced here on cargo ships or in contaminated seeds, hay bales, attached to livestock. And purple loosestrife is a good example of that. It's native to Europe and Asia, and it was unintentionally introduced to the United States Great Lakes area through contaminated solid cargo ship ballast. So, why do invasives outcompete natives here? So, they generally grow incredibly quickly. By and large, invasive plants spread far more seeds than natives. So, they can reproduce in great abundance. And of course, that enables them to spread rapidly. Because most invasive plants leaf out earlier than natives and they lose their leaves later than natives, they have more time for growth and photosynthesis. And that longer growing season obviously gives them a better chance at survival. Norway maple is a great example of that one. Invasives crowd out the natives and they shield them from the sunlight, which kills the natives. And sometimes they even produce substances in the soil that make it inhospitable to any other plant. And the tree of heaven is a good example of that. And garlic mustard is another example of that. Garlic mustard exudes compounds that alter the soil chemistry to favor its survival at the expense of other species. And this is a concept known as allelopathy. And it's a mechanism that harms the mycorrhizae, or the symbiotic root fungi, which contribute greatly to tree health. Invasives are also not very picky about their environment. They can more readily withstand variables in temperature, soil, water, and climate change is facilitating the growth of invasives. They can survive extreme temperatures and volatility more readily. So, all right, most people think, okay, it's okay if I have an invasive in my yard because I'm controlling it and it won't spread. But how is that not the case? Let's get some ideas why people think it's not okay. How do you think invasives like Pachysandra and English ivy get from gardens into natural spaces, woods, miles and miles from your house? Can I get some ideas on that?
Bird poop.
Yeah, bird poop, deer.
Wind, animals, animal droppings.
Yeah. So a lot of people think, oh no, it's no problem. I control my English ivy. But the problem obviously is that these invasives escape cultivation when the deer or birds eat the berries, move into the woods, and that creates generally a grove. Seeds can survive in the soil up to a decade or more. So, when areas are disturbed, like an area is cleared for a building or someone tills, or any time that the soil is disturbed, those seeds germinate quickly. They see the light of day and they are on it. Lots of times, invasives are improperly disposed of and tossed into a natural area. So you can't just, take out some English ivy and then, toss it into the woods. Invasives need to be bagged and tied and then sent to the landfill. And also, sometimes just cutting and moving lumber can disperse seeds. Or if you go for a hike in the woods, your dog might have seeds on it, or you might have seeds on your shoes. So sometimes they just spread that way. Not all plants are invasive in all environments. So the plants that are invasive here are not native. They have not co evolved with animals and insects that eat them, for example. There are no natural diseases here to attack the non native plants to help keep their population in check. There is more space for invasives to monopolize because humans have cleared land for development and agriculture. And again, that frees those long buried seeds and allows them to germinate. So, that same 2018 Washington Post magazine that I mentioned about the Callery pear states that the wild trees in China, the pear trees, are not invasive there or particularly common. It's what we did to the pear here in the US that has turned it against us. And I'm quoting now, we brought it to an alien environment, selected one for unnatural propagation, and then fused genetically different individuals together. We planted it extensively across the entire continental United States, seeding its eventual spread. And today it is a roving, free range freak, unquote. That's from the US Agriculture Department scientists. This is all a little overwhelming and a little dispiriting, but there are things that we can do. And one of the big things that we can do is get rid of the invasives as much as possible. And we can talk more about methods later. We can educate the public. That's why I'm so pleased that you're all here. We can spread the word about invasives. We can help reduce them by not buying them from nurseries or sharing them with others. So I had a hairdresser a few years ago, and she had a Japanese maple in her front yard. And I always encouraged her very gently. Well, actually, I didn't encourage her to get rid of it, but I did tell her it was an invasive plant technically. And she was very proud the next time I saw her. And she said, I got rid of my Japanese maple and I sold it to my neighbor. So that didn't help. Don't accidentally transport invasives by carrying their seeds on your socks or your pants or on your dog's fur. Let your congressperson know your concerns. There's been some good legislation here in Virginia lately about invasive plants. And of course, what else can you do? You can plant natives. Any native plant that you put in your yard is helping the ecosystem. As Doug Tallamy encourages, and I quote, your small plot is connected to other plots, which are connected to others and others and others. Collectively, they are North America. Changing the plant base of all suburbia is quite an undertaking, but all you have to worry about is your eighth of an acre. Planting the back and side borders of your lot will provide more habitat than you might think, unquote. And research is showing that efforts to remove invasive species from natural areas, these concerted efforts, it is resulting in a regrowth of native plants. We can make a difference, and it does work. You can help the most by replacing lost habitat of native plants in your own yards. Wildlife desperately needs more people to plant mostly native. Studies show that areas that have not as many native plants have lesser survival rate for nestlings. So planting one oak tree in your yard can feed a lot of baby birds. We need to choose native plants when we landscape and replace more lawn space with native plants to counteract the destruction of the natural habitats. By the way, speaking of lawn, did you know that none of what we consider lawn grasses here, like fescue, is native? It's called Kentucky fescue, but it's not native to the United States. So that's food for thought. We could reduce the Japanese beetle population just by reducing our lawns because the Japanese beetles need lawns to survive. Their larvae develop primarily on grass roots. So less lawn, fewer Japanese beetles. And landscaping with native plants can also combat climate change. Many native plants, especially long living trees like oaks and maples, they're very effective at storing the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide. And finally, because native plants are adapted to local environmental conditions, they require far less water. I was just at one of our demo gardens recently, and one of my colleague master gardeners was remarking that they just planted a bunch of native plants earlier this year, and the weather's been so hot and steamy, and she was rather pleasantly surprised at how the native plants were surviving better than other things that have been planted because they're native and they deal with less water better. Okay, we talked about what's an invasive plant. What exactly is a native plant? And on the screen is Doug Tallamy's definition. Native plants provide so much more as far as food and nutrition and other benefits because, again, native animals have co evolved for many, many years with our native plants. And so our animal species, and that includes butterflies, bees, birds, insects, and other mammals, need those native plants to survive. So you can still have some non-natives in your yard. We all love camellia, chrysanthemum, anemone, helleborus, peonies. But try, if you can, to aim for 80 to 90% natives in your yard. And it doesn't have to be all of a sudden either. It can be a slow evolution, little bits, baby steps. But having the vast majority be natives is really essential to supporting our native animals. So here's an example of how non-native plants just don't work for our native animals. Doug Tallamy studied insect populations on two species of trees. It was the native white oak and the non-native Bradford pear. And on two occasions, he counted the number of caterpillars on the tree at about head height on both of the trees, which were both about the same height and approximate age. He found 410 caterpillars of 19 different species on the oak tree and only one caterpillar on the pear tree. I think it was a little inchworm. And in a second study of the same sort, he showed 233 individuals of 15 species on the oak tree. And again, one worm on the pear tree. So our oaks have so many more caterpillars because caterpillars have co-evolved with our native trees to eat non-toxic leaves that provide them with high levels of nutrients. We're going to come back to why I'm obsessed with caterpillars and why they're so important in just a bit. Native plants have co-evolved with animal species to the point that some animal species specialize, or they depend only on one plant genus or species for food and shelter. These animals just cannot survive without a particular specific plant. And there are some good examples. A lot of you know one of them. So the larvae of the zebra swallowtail butterfly feed exclusively on the new leaves of the pawpaw tree, Asamina triloba. I think most of you know that milkweed is the host plant for monarch caterpillars. That means it's the only plant that they can eat. And please note that planting Mexican or tropical or exotic milkweed, which is not native, will hasten the demise of the monarchs. Its long time bloom disorients their concept of season and causes them to stay too long before they migrate south. and they end up dying in the freeze. So plant lots and lots of milkweed, but keep it native. Don't plant the exotic milkweed. Spicebush and sassafras are the host plants for the spicebush swallowtail butterflies. And there's an entire list of host plants and butterflies on the Penn State Extension website if you're interested. All right, so let's get back to caterpillars. Why is the abundance of caterpillars so important? Anybody have a guess? Why do I care so much about caterpillars?
Bird food.
You guys are not really needing this
Birds
presentation.
needed for young.
Okay, very good. So let's get some guesses. How many caterpillars a day a mama bird needs to feed her nestlings?
Eva says thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 was another guess.
All right, here's the answer. Carolina chickadees and most birds actually feed their babies almost exclusively caterpillars. 95 to 100% of the insects that they hunt are caterpillars. Little baby birds can't eat hard bugs, so they need these soft, squishy caterpillars. So, yes, chickadees bring 390 to 570 caterpillars per day, and they feed the babies for 16 to 18 days in the nest and then more after they fledge. So the number of caterpillars required before they fledge is between 6,000 and 10,000 caterpillars. So the most beneficial tree you can possibly plant is a white oak, which hosts over 500 species of caterpillars. It's the best bird feeder you could have. This is a very educated audience. But it's not just about how many caterpillars a species of a plant can host. So the other thing that makes native plants far superior to non-native is that they produce much better nutrition to native animals with which they co-evolved. So to get an idea of the nutrition differences between native plants and invasive plants for our local wildlife, take a look at the amount of fat in a native plant berry compared with invasive plant berries. Birds and mammals really desperately need lots of good quality fat for nutrition and to survive the winter. And many plants look like natives, but they don't have nearly the same value or benefits for our local wildlife. For example, a calorie pear looks a lot like a service berry, but it offers very little to local wildlife compared to a service berry, which is extremely valuable for wildlife. Okay, I think this is a good time to take some questions before we really delve into what are the invasives and what plants can we use instead.
Courtney had asked if you could address native plants that become invasive, and I think she probably meant very aggressive because of spreading. For example, Jerusalem artichoke or others that just once planted are hard to get rid of. So, for example, bully natives that are crowding out other beneficial natives in the garden. Is that something you can talk a little bit about?
That is a very interesting question. I think the answer to dealing with those is when my yarrow took over, I just yanked it all out. And I think dealing with an aggressive native is probably the same MO as dealing with an invasive, and that is hand pooling is really the best thing. That's what I would recommend. It's very important to research what you want to plant before you plant it and research whether it's aggressive and don't put it in an area where you want it to take over your garden. I did not do that. I planted whitewood aster in a garden that I wanted to be very behaved. And the whitewood aster reseeded everywhere. I just kept moving it over to a more wild area. I just kept pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, and moving it. So I think you just have to research it. And if it ends up in an area you don't want it, I think you just have to hand pull it and take care of it that way. It's a very good idea to learn about the plant you're about to plant.
Joyce, you said that we seem to have a lot of grub in native pollinator gardens. Do they provide food for birds or just those raccoons?
I think it depends what kind of grubs they are. It's sometimes difficult to tell what kind of grub it is. But yes, grubs absolutely provide food. Larvae is absolutely food for wildlife. All right, let's dive into some of these invasives. Well, this is such a knowledgeable audience. I usually ask what trees might be invasive, but I know this audience already knows. So you might be surprised at some of these, though, and you may have some of these in your yard. These are all sort of in order of popular trees that people have planted and they are still planting. And they're sort of top of the order here. So, Norway maple. By the way, in all of these slides, there is a distribution map in the upper left-hand corner of where this plant has been reported as invasive. So let's talk about IDing Norway maple as opposed to our native maples. It kind of looks like a sugar maple, but it leaves out earlier, and those samaras, those little helicopter fruits, they are spread out wider, whereas sugar maple samaras point downward. And the stem that attaches the leaf, the petiole, that emits a milky sap in a Norway maple when it's removed during the growing season. It also has the largest terminal bud. That's the bud that's closest to the end of the branch of all the maples. So why is it bad? So it grows faster than native maples. It has a very dense, shallow root system, and that makes it hard for native seedlings to get established. It tolerates poor soils and air pollution and lots of different environments, and it's planted in abundance for its hardiness. It is a prolific seed producer, and it can germinate and grow in full shade. So it crowds out native plants, and it provides less food and nutrition to our native wildlife. Obviously, there are lots of alternatives to the Norway maple, the sugar maple, the red maple, or even a northern red oak. A huge variety of wildlife use northern red oak for food, including blue jays, wild turkeys, squirrels, and other small rodents, white-tailed deer, raccoons, and even black bears. There are actually over 100 vertebrate species that eat acorns. And according to Doug Tallamy, oak trees support more life than any other species in North America. Together, all of the oak species host around 900 species of caterpillars. And the early flowering and the sap of maple trees supports honeybees, and maples are a food source for animals. We all know that the Callery pear is an invasive plant. It is very quickly choking out native species in natural areas and parks. It creates monocultures. It reduces diversity of plant species, which is so crucial for wildlife. And animals, including bees and birds, they need a lot of different species because they need a continuous supply of food. And every plant blooms and produces fruit at different times. So when you have a monoculture, you've got fruit just produced at one time and nectar and pollen just at one time. You need lots of different species blooming at different times and producing fruit at different times. Again, the Bradford pear leaves out before native species, and that gives them a survival edge. And they grow in even the poorest conditions. And we've probably all noticed that its limbs fall off and break really easily, which makes them dangerous. Instead of the Callery pear, I think the serviceberry bloom looks very similar to the Bradford pear, but it benefits wildlife far more. It provides the pollen and nectar for early season butterflies and bees, and also birds. So cedar waxwings, robins, catbirds, thrushes, mockingbirds, and even the famous Baltimore oriole love it. And redbuds is another alternative. Redbuds provide pollen for bees and nectar for butterflies and hummingbirds. Again, remember that Tallamy experiment where he found only one caterpillar on the pear trees. Pear trees just do not provide nutrients to birds. You could also try, if you want that size tree, a hawthorn, a crabapple, or a white fringe tree, all of which are beautiful understory flowering trees about the same size. The tree of heaven. It looks a lot like a black walnut, but if you crush a leaf in your hand and it smells like peanut butter, it's a tree of heaven. Also, it flowers differently. So it has these massive clusters of the samaras, those helicopter fruits. If you see that, you know it is a tree of heaven. Whereas the black walnut has obviously huge green walnuts. The barks are a little bit different too. The tree of heaven bark is more stretched and smooth. And again, why is the tree of heaven bad? It is a prolific seed producer. It can reproduce via its root system, suckering growth, and it grows under lots of different conditions. It is hard to kill. You have to cut it down and then apply an herbicide to the stump. And like garlic mustard, it makes the soil around it inhospitable to other species. If you like the look of a tree of heaven, plant a black walnut tree. They are doppelgangers, just about. And the nuts of the black walnut are food for many rodents. It makes up about 10% of the diet of eastern fox squirrels. The black walnut hosts about 23 species of native moths, including the dagger moths, luna moths, and walnut caterpillar moths. And many of these are consumed by songbirds, including chickadees, bluebirds, nuthatches, wrens, and more. Princess tree. This is pretty easy to ID because it has such massive leaves. If you're still not sure, look at the underside of the leaf. It is tomentose, which means very hairy. These are from the central and western China area. Each of those seed capsules has about 2,000 plus seeds, and it can grow 10 to 20 feet per year, and it tolerates a very wide range of soils. The mimosa tree, I'm seeing this all over the place. It's blooming right now. It is from Iran and central China or Japan. It's pretty easy to ID. It looks pretty unique. It's a very aggressive tree that invades disturbed natural areas, a lot of roadsides, forests, stream banks. I'm seeing this a lot along the highway driving around 495. And again, this tree produces a huge number of seeds and is not very picky about its soil or its conditions. It's extremely adaptable. Lots of alternatives. River birches. River birches can help prevent erosion because of their strong roots, and they provide beauty in the winter with their exfoliating white trunks. They also support the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly during its migration. And river birches serve as a host plant for morning cloak and dreamy dusk wing butterflies. I don't know who comes up with these names. Someday I want a job naming butterflies. And it supports a variety of silk moths and provides seeds for a variety of birds. Dogwoods and crabapples are also both natives that provide a very important source of fruit for small mammals and songbirds. And there are many, many species of crabapple, southern crabapple, and sweet crabapple. There are two that are native to the mid-Atlantic, and they also hybridize. There are a lot of cultivars available, but anything is better than an invasive. Remember again the non-native trees that provide no nutrition to the native wildlife. These trees provide a lot of service to wildlife. The white mulberry tree, Morus alba, that was introduced to the US during colonial times for the purpose of establishing a silkworm industry. But that effort was actually an epic fail. And then we were left with all of these white mulberry trees. In the meantime, then it's widespread in the US. It occurs in every state of the lower 48, except for Nevada. It invades old fields, urban lots, roadsides, forest edges, and other disturbed areas. And again, it tolerates a broad range of soil and it's heat and drought tolerant. We have a native red mulberry. Unfortunately, the white mulberry is hybridizing with and displacing the native red mulberry. You can ID from the different leaves and berries, but it's a little difficult to tell. Native mulberry leaves are significantly larger, the fruit and leaves, than the white mulberry if you looked at them side to side. Looking at it without a comparison, it's difficult to tell the difference. Each of these natives provides a lot more nutrition. Black gums, Nyssa sylvatica, is absolutely gorgeous in the fall. Beautiful, beautiful fall color. It provides nectar for bees, fruits for birds and small mammals. And note if you plant a black gum that they are dioecious. That means that the tree is either male or female. So if you want the berries, which you do, you need to plant at least one male plant to fertilize the female trees. But all of these trees are fantastic choices if you want to provide nutritious fruit to wildlife. I'm going to ask the audience what shrubs you know of that are invasive.
Nandina,
Uh-huh.
barberry, burning bush.
Great. You guys already know a lot of these. So again, we're going to progress from plants that people plant a lot to maybe some that you don't know about. So yes, barberry. That was introduced to the United States as an ornamental in 1875. It's still being sold in nurseries. It grows well in everything from full sun to deep shade, and it forms these widespread thickets in a closed canopy forest, but also open woodlands, wetlands, fields, and other areas. It is just not fussy. Studies show it harbors 400% more ticks than our native shrubs. It just provides an awesome microclimate environment for ticks. Where it is well established, it displaces many native herbaceous and woody plants. And in large infestations, its leaf litter can actually change the chemistry of the soil. It makes it more basic and it leaves out earlier than natives, right around the end of March, beginning of April. If you look into the woods, the only green shrubs you see are the arching branches of the escaped barberries. They form dense thickets pretty quickly. Its berries really don't have as much nutrition for the birds or mammals. I took this video of a hike in Oregon Ridge Park in Maryland on April 2nd last year. So it's early spring, and you can see that the entire forest floor, as far as you can see, is this swath of spreading Japanese barberries. So even if you're not an ecologist, your gut probably tells you this is not a good thing for the forest ecosystem. And notice that they have a huge advantage because nothing else is leafing out yet. So they have a head start on the growing season. And these barberries are obviously taking up space that should be inhabited by native plants. This actually happened, I believe, because they culled some of the trees in this park and disturbed the forest soil. And I think all of these latent seeds just started popping up, and these barberries sort of took over. They're killing natives, preventing natives from germinating. These barberries originally came from people's yards where they planted Japanese barberries. Instead of barberries, there are some good options. You can plant inkberry instead of boxwood. Boxwood is an alternative. It's not invasive, but inkberries are much less susceptible to diseases and the pests and the problems of boxwoods. And inkberries benefit bees with their small little white flowers in the spring. And inkberry is a host plant for the Henry elfin butterfly. Those small pollinators really enjoy the nectar and the pollen of the inkberry, whereas the boxwoods don't support pollinators. And again, they're sort of rife with diseases and pests often. If you really want evergreen, there are some other options. Yaupon holly is an option, or mountain laurel, both of which come in many different sizes and cultivars. If you're open to deciduous, there are some other options. Bayberry can help control erosion, and it provides fruit for winter birds. And the black chokeberry, which turns a beautiful red in the fall, and it has dark berries. Japanese holly is reported as invasive in many counties now. It's still widely planted as another evergreen that is deer resistant. So instead of Japanese holly, try the Yaupon holly. It is another alternative to barberry or boxwood. It's one of the closest matches in foliage appearance, and its growth habit is kind of like a boxwood. It's actually native to the southeast US, okay, up to zone 7, which is just about everywhere around here. And it has red berries and no thorns on its branches, unlike a barberry. And note that they're very similar to the Japanese holly, but the Japanese holly is invasive and this one is native. Bamboo, somebody pointed out bamboo. So not only does heavenly bamboo aggressively take over and crowd out natives, and not only is it not nutritious for wildlife, it actually kills birds. So birds can die of cyanide poisoning from eating its berries, and in particular, cedar waxwings, whose diet consists almost wholly of fruit, unlike other birds. Cedar waxwing deaths have been documented in Georgia and Houston. In Decatur, Georgia in 2016, a resident discovered 14 dead cedar waxwings outside of their local high school. A necropsy report on the birds found that they died from cyanide, ostensibly from the nearby heavenly bamboo. Cedar waxwings will usually eat fruit from serviceberries or other natives, but if the native plants are in short supply, they will eat the nandina. People love that red berry, that persistent berry on the heavenly bamboo. So if you like the red berries, try a winter berry. That provides food for over 48 bird species, and especially when food sources are scarce in the winter. And it puts on a beautiful winter color show. If you have room for a small tree, instead try a hawthorn or a dogwood. They both have lots of persistent red berries. And if you can go even bigger, you could put a American holly, Ilex opaca. Burning bush, somebody knows about burning bush. That was originally introduced from Asia in the mid 1800s, and its ability to invade natural areas was first documented in the 1970s. It can grow in full shade and spread with abundant fruit production. It's primarily spread by birds dispersing their highly visible and abundant fruit. And the fruit often do persist into winter when they become even more visible to birds and mammals, but the fruit is not nutritious for them. It is widely planted for its fall color. I think that's what most people love about burning bush. So here are some plants that also have beautiful fall color. So the silky dogwood, it's also a host plant for the spring and summer azure butterflies. Its fruits are eaten by songbirds, ruffed grouse, quail, turkey, chipmunks, black bear, foxes, deer, skunks, squirrels, and the smoke tree. Finches and other birds and small mammals eat its fruits, and four moth species rely exclusively on this tree. And then there's Virginia sweet spire and fothergilla. They're two of my favorites. Both have these profuse, beautiful white blooms in the spring and gorgeous fall color. And also, they both come in large and dwarf sizes. And burning bush doesn't have those showy flowers and it gets unwieldy huge. So these are much better options for fall color. Another beautiful plant with winter interest is the Cornus sericea, the red twig dogwood. Japanese spirea, unfortunately, a very popular garden plant because it has a showy flower and it's deer resistant. It was introduced here around 1870. It's invading many natural areas from Minnesota to Louisiana and Maine, all the way down to Georgia. It forms very dense patches that fill in open areas. You can see a photo on the bottom, and it creates deep shade that displace and prevent native woody and herbaceous plants and impedes the growth of native seedlings. These are all great alternatives to Japanese spirea. The Spirea alba is native. There's nine bark and there's cleffa or sweet pepper bush. Some other options would be silky dogwood, Cornus amomum, or there is leatherleaf, Dirca palustris. These are very popular garden plants, the Asian viburnums. Again, they were introduced in the early 1800s, so they have been around a while. They are reported as invasive from Massachusetts on over to Michigan and then south all the way from North Carolina and Missouri. They all look similar, so they're hard to tell apart. They grow in forests, forest edges, old fields in full sun to part shade. And they form, again, thickets that cast a deep shade where native plants can't take root. And again, they leaf out earlier and keep their leaves later than native viburnums. And the deer, unfortunately, prefer to munch on the native viburnums, which gives the invasives an advantage. There are fabulous native viburnums, and they all produce lovely spring flowers and fall berries. Of the Viburnum dentatum, the arrowwood, there is a popular nursery stock out there of a variety called Blue Muffin, and it's not a straight species or an original native species, it's a cultivar, but it is deer resistant and it's better than an invasive Asian viburnum. Just check your plant tags and make sure you're getting a native viburnum if you want to plant a viburnum. Butterfly bush. Butterfly bush has been planted in landscapes. People think it's great to attract butterflies, obviously, bees, moths, birds, but it escapes from plantings and invades a variety of habitats, including surface mined lands, coastal forest edges, roadsides, lots of roadsides, abandoned railroads, and it obviously displaces native plants. Now, it does attract butterflies because it provides a lot of nectar, but butterflies need a host plant on which to lay eggs and on which their caterpillars then feed. And not a single native caterpillar can eat butterfly bush leaves. To have butterflies, the caterpillars need plants to eat. So no native caterpillars can eat the butterfly bush. And so all of that tempting nectar from the butterfly bush distracts pollinators from their native co-flowering species. So the native species are not pollinated as well, which makes them decrease in number. There are so many alternatives to butterfly bush, and these are all great plants for butterflies. The coneflower photo and the milkweed photo are from my garden. Studies show that Pica bella is a coneflower that attracts more native butterflies than some other varieties. And there are also some great shrubs to attract butterflies. It doesn't have to be a perennial. And these are just three examples of many: the Clethra onifolia, sweet pepper bush, and then there's again Virginia sweet spire, and buttonbush is fantastic for butterflies. Chinese privet is one of the worst invasive plants in the South, according to invasivespeciesinfo.gov. It dominates the shrub layer and it often becomes the only shrub underneath the trees. Again, it's that monoculture that we talked about, especially in stream side areas. It's native to Europe and Asia, and it was introduced in 1852 as an ornamental plant, but it's still really commonly used as an ornamental shrub, and lots of people like to plant hedgerows of it. So, what can we plant instead of privet? We've got lots of great alternatives. American beautyberry. The seeds of American beautyberry are a really important food source for at least 10 species of birds and small mammals, especially the northern bobwhite. Buttonbush, we just talked about that in the previous slide. It provides food for the larval stage of many butterflies and moths, including the beautiful wood nymph and the Titan sphinx. Here we go with these fun butterfly names again: hydrangea sphinx. And it has lots of nectar. The flowers attract the butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds. You can also plant the clethra, the sweet pepper bush, and native azaleas instead of privet. Okay, I'm not going to again bother to ask the audience. I think everybody knows that English ivy by now is invasive. You might discover there are some vines that you didn't know were invasive. So let's talk about English ivy. Unfortunately, still widely sold and planted. It's obviously a non native invasive evergreen climbing vine, and it covers and kills the trees. And as a ground cover, it chokes out other plants and it creates an ivy desert where nothing else can grow or germinate. One of the problems with it is it persists in the winter, so it makes the tree limbs even heavier. So during ice storms, the trees are much more susceptible to breaking. And it enables fire to climb up to the canopy and spread more quickly, as I mentioned in the beginning. It's a big problem. Japanese Pachysandra. This is also an invasive. That was actually the photo on the bottom is escaped Pachysandra into a wooded park along the trail. And there's also multiflora rose in that photo. So that's Pachysandra that escaped somebody's yard as a ground cover, and it's now taking over the woods. Vinca spreads pretty rapidly, especially in riparian or like river areas, creeks, drainages, and it grows pretty vigorously and it forms these dense and extensive mats along the forest floor, which obviously displace native herbaceous and woody plant species. Ajuga naturalizes very easily. It spreads by stolones, or those horizontal stems that creep along the ground. And Liriope. Liriope is quickly becoming a problem with invasive spreading. It's also making its way into the invasive realm. So these two are not as widespread yet as some of the other problem invasive ground covers, but they could get there quickly. So it may be a good idea to replace it before it's too late, because as we discussed, it really can be too late after something is discovered it's invasive. There are so many better options among native ground cover choices. So let's look at some of the native ground cover. These are all much better choices. There's wild ginger. Wild ginger is a larval host plant for the pipe vine swallowtail butterfly. Flies and beetles are its pollinators. It's also very deer resistant and it can take wet, shaded slopes. And there's also green and gold. Green and gold's flowers are very attractive to bees and butterflies, and songbirds eat the seeds. And it's also a good evergreen ground cover. Virginia creeper is one of my favorites. It hosts 32 species of caterpillars, including the striking Pandora sphinx and Abbott sphinx moth caterpillars. It has gorgeous fall color and birds love its berries. It can be a vine or it can be a ground cover. So please note it is not poison ivy. It grows like it. It has almost the same growth pattern. So people often mistake it for poison ivy because of the way it grows. But its leaves are very different and it doesn't have the same fuzzy stem that poison ivy does. So Virginia creeper has 5 leaves and poison ivy has 3 leaves. And look for that fuzzy stem. If it has the fuzzy stem, it's poison ivy. If it doesn't, it's Virginia creeper. Side note though about poison ivy is a native plant that is terrific for wildlife. It's just not so terrific for humans. Another plant here is crested iris. Crested iris is super deer resistant and it spreads very easily. Good for shade. Purple loosestrife is another perennial that has a pretty negative effect on wildlife and agriculture. It displaces and replaces native plants. It's a huge area of concern because it's causing a reduction of habitat size for spawning fish and waterfowl in wetlands. These are just a few examples of the many, many, many native perennials that sort of look like a purple loosestrife. There are a lot of purple and blue blooming perennials. There's actually a whole list of particular butterflies and bees that specialize on these plants alone. And though I've been reading some of them to you, I'm going to spare you and not read them all. But I will point out that blazing star has flowers that are very attractive to butterflies and bees. And the great blue lobelia is typically pollinated by bees. Digger bees also collect nectar from its flowers, and white yellow faced bees, green sweat bees, all sorts of native bees. And ironweed, its seeds are great for butterflies and birds. Okay, Chinese wisteria. Chinese and Japanese wisteria are a problem. Chinese wisteria was first imported in 1816. It's been here a while. And then Japanese wisteria was imported shortly after that in 1830. And, because these vines grew so quickly and they provided this great dense shade, it was a favorite for people's porches and trellises and gazebos. It grows really rapidly. It can reach up to 70 feet and have 15-inch trunks. So it easily climbs native understory trees and even canopy trees. And the dense shade that it creates and its weight alone smother and kill trees. It's especially a problem in warmer southern states where native ecosystems are being wiped out by it in some cases. This clematis is another invasive vine. It is native to Japan and China. Not all clematis is invasive. This one is. It's got the really smaller flowers. It grows very aggressively in many areas of North America. It can climb 25 to 30 feet, and it sometimes can smother trees and pull down telephone poles even. It forms a dense, tangled mass that can cover the ground and other vegetation. And it grows in everything from full sun to shade. So it's very adaptable to a variety of soil conditions. And it produces a number of wind dispersed seeds. So it can aggressively self seed and escape cultivation. So many good vines to try instead of that. We've got trumpet honeysuckle, which is a favorite of hummingbirds, American wisteria, and there is a native clematis, the virgin's bower, and there's a trumpet vine, which if you don't want it to go crazy or if you don't have room for it, maybe shy away from the trumpet vine. Okay, so common daylilies. When I was a kid, we had these growing along the stream in our backyard, tiger lilies, and I thought they were so pretty, but they kept multiplying and multiplying. And daylilies do pose a significant threat to native plants and natural areas. They can take over fields and meadows, floodplains, moist woods, and forest edges. And once it's established, it multiplies and spreads to form dense patches that displace native plants. Its thick tubers also make it a challenge to control. But there are some great alternatives. We have a Turk's cap lily, Canada lily, and wood lily. And again, I'm going to spare you a pretty long list of pollinators and butterflies and hummingbirds that these lilies benefit. Okay, there are also invasive grasses. I think that we probably all know bamboo is invasive, but did we know it was a grass? Yes, bamboo is a grass, and people plant it as a screen. But there are lots of great evergreen natives that you can use instead. American hollies, eastern red cedar, rhododendron, magnolias, they all make wonderful screens. Bamboo, as you probably already know, spreads vegetatively, so underground rhizomes, and it's very difficult to control through mowing or mechanical means. If you just leave one small piece of its rhizome in the ground, it's enough for an entire colony of bamboo to start growing again. If you really like the look of bamboo, there is a native bamboo. It's called giant reed. It can also form a dense patch of monoculture called a canebrake, but its canebrake provides cover and food for dozens of species of mammals and invertebrates, including a number of native butterflies and moths. Sadly, these native reeds are decreasing because of livestock overgrazing. Miscanthus sinensis, or Japanese silvergrass, is another invasive grass. It's pretty tall, it gets up to 12 feet, and it is a densely bunched grass that can invade roadsides, forest edges, old fields, and other disturbed areas. Instead of silvergrass, we have a number of wonderful native grasses, wild oats. Its seeds are eaten by small mammals and birds. There's bluestem, which provides cover to several ground nesting birds, and the threatened Henlo's sparrow uses it. The grasshopper sparrow, sedge wren, western meadowlark are also very common visitors to the plant, and chipping sparrows will eat its seeds too. Rush is a great food source for wildlife too. Songbirds, waterfowl, muskrats, quail, gophers, and rabbits all eat the seeds. And again, it provides cover for all kinds of wildlife from waterfowl to amphibians. Muskrats actually use rushes to build their houses. Okay, so some of you, but not all, I think, have been shocked that maybe some of the plants in your yard are actually invasive plants. So some of them may have planted, and some you may have inherited, and some may have invaded your yard. And you can really help by trying to get rid of them and replacing them with natives and spreading the word to your neighbors. Hand pulling is the most effective method usually. Every season, I spent 5 hours just hand pulling this invasive Japanese stiltgrass from underneath a row of white pines that I had in my side yard. Be careful when you're hand pulling that the plant is not in seed, or you could be inadvertently spreading the seeds as you pull them out. So you've got to pull them at the right time of year. And if you're not sure what the right time of year is, you can Google, you can ask Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia or an extension website if you're not sure. For larger areas of ground cover like vinca, English ivy, pachysandra, sometimes it works to spread a tarp out over them and plant and stake the ends to deprive it of sunlight. For English ivy going up a tree, you don't want to just yank it off of the tree because you could damage the tree bark. There is a window method that you can Google, but I can explain it quickly, and some of you already may know about it. But you basically cut a window along the trunk of the tree and just kind of cut the plant off from its roots, and then just gently, very gently pull the ivy away from just part of the trunk of the tree. If hand pulling just is not an option, an herbicide sometimes is the only thing that can do the trick. But by law, follow the label and remember it kills everything. So you're not just going to be killing the invasive plant you want, you're going to be killing anything around it. And also remember, if you ever use an herbicide, again, follow the label and the law and wear protective clothing. A good method to chop down a vine, for example, like Oriental bittersweet, is to maybe use some concentrated herbicide and carefully paint the stub of it after you've cut it down, after you've cut the vine. You can use a pre-emergent formulated for your specific plant. This actually works pretty well with Japanese stiltgrass. It works by preventing the seeds of the annual from germinating the following season. But I always recommend consulting with a professional to do that. And remember that there are laws that govern the spray of herbicides. Sometimes mowing can help keep invasives at bay. Just keep mowing, just keep depriving the top of sunlight so it cannot photosynthesize. And if you can't remove them, if you just cannot remove something, plants spread with fruits. So try removing the fruits with pruning at the right time so that the seeds cannot be dispersed. There are some wonderful resources and lots of great books and websites to use and lots of great references. So that is going to wrap it up for me. And I am very happy to take questions. Again, I am very grateful that you've all attended and are interested. And so I will take as many questions as I can answer. And if I can't answer it, I will tell you that we will get the answer to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Julie. We did have a lot of questions in this section. One question was about the exclusion of the white mulberry. And the question was, how did Nevada exclude white mulberry? Surrounded, so they must have undertaken an eradication and control effort. And what might those efforts have been?
That is a really good question. And I just admit that I have no idea what the answer is. But now that somebody has asked that, I'm curious and I will Google it.
Okay, the next question is, can trumpet vine, and by that we're specifically speaking about Campsis radicans, not the coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens, can that successfully be grown in pots because it's quite aggressive spreader, or will it still spread because by birds and other natural ways?
Well, I think that it would still spread in natural ways. That would be my guess. I have had that plant in a garden for, I think it's been 16 years, and I just keep digging out seedlings of it. So I'm pretty sure it can spread without that. If you're afraid that it's going to take over, I might stay away from it. If you have a place where it can really take over, then go for it.
Somebody else asked, is gooseneck loosestrife as bad as the purple loosestrife? They specifically mentioned that they just saw a big stand of it in the National Arboretum and some coming up in one of their established beds with ferns.
That is another good question. I would have to look that up. I'm careful about Latin names. I would need to know the genus and species, but I would have to look that one up. That's a good question.
I have one question just because we've been talking about so many things about like, is this invasive or is it as bad? Is it good or not? Julie, could you share with all of us your process for researching if a plant is invasive or not? Because of course we know that we have a lot of resources on our website, but what process do you go through? What sources do you check? How do you understand like the invasive status of a species?
Sure. I think so. I actually, full disclosure, just moved here from Maryland. And Maryland has a website that lists invasive species. And I believe Virginia has the same
They
website.
do.
So states, extension services have lists of what is deemed invasive by the state. However, invasive.org or invasive atlas is also a very good resource. And there are also native plant websites. Maryland had a native plant organization website that listed invasive species. So generally, when you Google, the state has an official list of invasive species. And I would caution anybody Googling anything about plants in a Google search to put the word extension in there, because then you're going to get an academically researched extension website.
My last tip is just obviously, I know a lot of us use common names in everyday discussion about plants, but they can get confusing. And there are some plants that have very similar common names. So, also when researching, it can be very helpful to make sure you have the proper Latin name or scientific name to research the plant too. There was one other discussion, which again, I think we've addressed, is just looking for sources to purchase native shrubs like Fothergilla and Virginia Sweetspire. And we gave a link in the chat. But Julie, if you have any other suggestions on how to know what you're purchasing and making sure that you're really getting a native species, I'm sure the audience would be really willing to hear that.
I think that the resources that you put out there are great. There are also some online resources for native plants that we could make available. There are a lot of resources on mgnv.org. I would always check labels. The other thing to Google, if you're maybe using an internet site that claims it has native plants, is to also Google whether they use pesticides in their growth. I think that's very important.
Julie, I just wanted to again thank you so much for this presentation on replacing invasives with natives.